On August 20th, 1975, mankind's first mission to definitively search for extraterrestrial life truly began. This is when the Viking 1 lander lifted off from Cape Canaveral bound for Mars, shortly followed by the Viking 2, which lifted off on September 9th, 1975. Both vehicles successfully made the journey to the Red Planet and set down in 1976 with life detection experiments on board. They were known as the label release experiments, coupled with two other experiments that were designed also to look for organic molecules and any other evidence for life on Mars. But the most significant of all the experiments specifically designed to detect biological activity on another planet, an experiment that had never produced a false positive during trials on Earth, came out positive for both Viking 1 and Viking 2. The creator of this experiment, Dr. Gilbert Levin, photographed here with his son Ron Levin at the time, was absolutely delighted with the news. All of his hard work, all of his effort to get his experiment included on the Viking missions had come to fruition, and they had produced positive results on another planet, definitively proving that life existed elsewhere. He popped a champagne cork, a cork that his colleagues signed together with the results of the experiment, and I had an opportunity to see this in person when Ron Levin generously allowed me to stay at his home for a few days last year, confident in the knowledge that he would one day win the Nobel Prize for Science for this discovery. However, shortly thereafter, NASA decided that in spite of the positive results of the experiment, and in spite of the fact that it produced positive results on a number of other modifications of the same experiment during Viking's mission, that the evidence was not conclusive enough. And this has been the story ever since. One piece of evidence after another has been discovered on the Red Planet, and yet astrobiologists have been unwilling to accept this evidence as being definitive proof for the existence of life. The only way to convince the scientific community that life had been discovered on Mars was to bring that life back here, or some evidence that that life had existed somewhere in the Martian regolith. A sample return mission was needed. So it was planned and it was funded, and now it has been canceled. But the People's Republic of China is capitalizing on this opportunity. And if they are successful, then they will be the ones who grab all of the credit for the discoveries that have been made by all of the American scientists who came before them. And in my opinion, they deserve every bit of it. Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to another Angry Bulletin. Something that really has me annoyed at the moment, and anytime something annoys me, well, anything in the spaceflight arena anyway, that's the time for me to make a video. Now, of course, this is not strictly a spaceflight topic, but rather a space science topic that's paired with a spaceflight issue. As many of you know, at least the ones who have been watching my channel for some time, NASA, in a variety of different missions, has gathered quite a lot of evidence, a snowballing collection of evidence to indicate that life on Mars existed at least in its ancient past, and most probably exists now as well. This evidence has been piling up ever since the first landing on Mars, the 1976 Viking mission. Well, that was the first successful landing. The Soviet Union were the first to actually put a human-manufactured vehicle on Mars, although it just crashed. It didn't actually really do much of anything, but that being said, the Viking missions definitely were successful, Viking 1 and Viking 2. And both of these vehicles had something called the label release experiment on board, created by Dr. Gilbert Levin. I'm going to go a little bit more into detail on this experiment later on in the video. But on top of that, there have been numerous other discoveries that have been made on Mars, mostly by the Curiosity rover, but also recently by the Perseverance rover, culminating in a moment when NASA believes that they have pretty convincing evidence now that life existed at least in Mars' ancient past. Geological evidence having been discovered that seems to indicate the activity of some sort of bacterial life, the sorts of telltale signs in the rocks that only exist side by side with active biology. At least that's the case here on Earth, and there doesn't seem to be anything, at least not in the region where these discoveries were made, that would suggest that any non-living process created these features that were recently discovered in Martian geology. All that having been said, though, it's still not enough evidence in the minds of astrobiologists. What is necessary is actual samples being returned from the Martian surface. And herein lies NASA's lost opportunity. This mission has been canceled, but China has no intention of canceling their sample return mission, and they're going to be lifting off in a mere 2 years, with a return mission being scheduled sometime in the early 2030s. And if all of that goes well, China is going to be taking all of the credit for discovering life on Mars, in spite of all of the decades of work done by the American scientists who preceded them. And all of this is the result of short-sighted individuals in the government and at NASA who have decided to shut down this mission, which was absolutely necessary in order to culminate all of the other effort that has been made to find life on Mars, all of the discoveries that have been made up to this point, all of the money that's been spent in order to make these discoveries. All of this is for nothing if China manages to carry out their sample return mission first. And I'm going to explain what their mission is, what their plans are, the discoveries that have led up to this point, and just how big of a tragedy this whole thing is for American astrobiology. So first of all, I'm going to give you a quick review of the label release experiment and the Viking missions, just to give you an idea of how long this process has been going on. In 1976, both Viking 1 and Viking 2 sat down on the surface of the red planet with several different life detection experiments on board. And interestingly enough, this was the last Mars mission, the last mission of any kind to have life detection equipment on board. For some reason, NASA has been putting no priority on this ever since. The label release experiment was designed to detect bacteria in drinking water. This is actually an experiment that had been around for a considerable amount of time, designed to test the purity of drinking water to make sure that it was safe for everyday consumption. It was an experiment that Dr. Gilbert Levin tested in hostile environments all over Earth to prove that it wouldn't produce a false positive under any circumstances, and it never did. At least it never did on Earth. So NASA, being convinced that the experiment was valid and had a decent chance of detecting life on Mars, if that life did indeed exist, allowed Dr. Levin to put the experiment on Viking, even though he wasn't really part of the NASA family. He hadn't done a whole lot of work for NASA in the past, and he wasn't even a doctor at the time that he proposed his experiment. And by the way, Dr. Levin did not do all of this alone. He worked together with his colleague, Dr. Patricia Ann Strott, who covered the results of the experiment in a book that she wrote called To Mars with Love. I strongly recommend that you read this. Never had an opportunity to interview her because sadly she passed away on October 23rd, 2020. All of that being the case, the experiment, together with the Viking landers, sat down on the red planet and promptly detected life. The whole idea behind the experiment was to introduce nutrients into Martian regolith with nutrients very similar to the types of nutrients that were probably prevalent in the early days of primitive life here on Earth. Nutrients that would probably be very attractive to primitive single-celled organisms. And they were tagged with radioactive isotopes. So if the microbes were to consume these nutrients, they would produce CO2 as a byproduct. And the CO2 would be marked with this radioactive isotope, therefore being easily detected. And this would indicate if the bacteria were devouring the nutrients. And as I said, it came back positive on both Viking 1 and Viking 2. To make certain that this wasn't some sort of non-biological process in action, Dr. Levin had the regolith subjected to an intense amount of heat, enough heat to kill any bacteria that might be present in the regolith. The nutrients were then reintroduced and nothing was consumed. If it were some sort of abiotic chemical process, the heat shouldn't have changed much of anything. But the introduction of heat should have killed bacteria, in which case the results should be negative, which they were. NASA was still not satisfied, so as a result, Dr. Levin then had the samples subjected to a lesser amount of heat. Enough heat to kill some of the bacteria, but not all of it. The nutrients were then reintroduced, and just as predicted, about 60% of the nutrients were consumed, but not all of them, exactly as would be expected if the samples were subjected to a smaller amount of heat, enough to kill some of the bacteria, but not all of them. NASA was still not satisfied. They felt that perhaps cosmic rays striking the regolith could somehow create these effects. So Dr. Levin had the Viking lander flip over a rock on the surface of Mars with the Viking lander's robotic arm, a rock that should have shielded the regolith beneath it from any cosmic rays and any solar radiation. He then tested the regolith that was underneath the rock, and it still came up positive. After all of these positive results, surely NASA would acknowledge this as being conclusive evidence. However, they didn't. And that's the way things have gone ever since when we're talking about the search for life on the red planet. The Martian rovers have discovered one piece of evidence after another, but it's never quite enough. The Curiosity rover, for example, detected a strange concentration of methane in the Martian atmosphere. It should only have been there in the presence of life or extensive volcanic activity in the area. And there was no volcanic activity in Curiosity's region of Mars at the time, so biology made the most sense. Still not enough evidence. In addition to that, more discoveries were made to conclusively prove that liquid water had been present in abundance. A warm climate had prevailed on the red planet in its ancient past, an environment that was absolutely conducive to the evolution of life, and on top of that, the presence of complex organic molecules that were not detected during the Viking mission. One of the experiments was dedicated towards the detection of organic molecules, and since that experiment came up negative, that was one of the justifications for not taking Dr. Levin's experiment as being definitive. Even though complex organic molecules have been discovered since then, however, it's still not enough. And then finally this year, the announcement of the discovery of the famous leopard spots in geology that only appear in the presence of active biological activity, active feeding bacteria. That is the only phenomena that creates these kinds of geological features, at least here on Earth. But of course, that wasn't enough either. The only thing that was going to convince the scientific community was a sample return mission, and NASA began to plan one. But unfortunately, those plans were doomed to failure as well. Okay, so that's a summary of all of the discoveries that have been made up to this point. Really, in the minds of most reasonable people, I would say that enough evidence has been gathered to indicate that there is at least some life on Mars, or that life existed in Mars' distant past at the very, very least. But this isn't enough to satisfy the scientific community. They need physical evidence, a physical sample that can be examined in detail. So why was this mission canceled, and what does China intend to do instead? There are a variety of different mission plans for a sample return, but overall they fit into the same general category. The idea was to put a new lander down on the surface of Mars, a lander that would have an ascent stage, the first time that a human-made object would lift off from the surface of Mars. Then either the Perseverance rover would deliver samples that it had gathered to this lander, or the lander would gather up samples that the Perseverance rover had been depositing all over the Martian surface over the last several years. Once the samples were delivered to the lander, then an ascent stage would be deployed, and the ascent stage would make its way into Martian orbit. Waiting for it in Martian orbit would be a European Space Agency orbiter. The ascent stage would dock with that orbiter, and the orbiter would carry the samples back to Earth. Then they would re-enter Earth's atmosphere into a very safe and secure area of White Sands, New Mexico, or some other area that could be effectively isolated from the rest of the human population, because who knows what sort of alien viruses might be on board this expedition, and the samples could be retrieved and Martian life finally detected. There were a number of different versions of this plan, but overall they fit this general description. Land something on Mars that has an ascent stage. The ascent stage brings the samples back home, either on its own or with the help of an orbiter. But the problem is the expense continued to balloon up to $11 billion. But after working on new mission architectures, NASA planners were able to get the estimated cost down to about $7 billion. But these were just estimates, and because it's such an unprecedented mission, there was a clear lack of certainty around those numbers. And the issue, as always, is money. There's heavy pressure on NASA to reduce its budget, since the Mars sample return mission still required large amounts of money, and since the technology to achieve it still wasn't clear, it was the obvious choice for cancellation. The mission was extremely complex, as I've already described to you. And in the current NASA budget, there still is some money for developing new technology related to the further exploration of Mars, but only a small amount, certainly not enough to fund a Mars sample return mission. But the moment NASA stumbled, China capitalized. On July the 22nd, China announced its first Mars sample return mission, Tianwen 3, scheduled for launch around 2028, 2 years from now, with a goal of returning no less than 0.5 kilogram of Mars samples to Earth by around 2031. Ho Zhengxiang of the Chinese Academy of Sciences and chief scientist of the Tianwen 3 mission, together with his collaborators, recently published an article in Nature Astronomy systematically outlining the overall plan and scientific objectives of the mission for the first time. Quote, "The mission will be a critical step in China's planetary exploration. We hope to provide the international community with an unprecedented opportunity to understand Mars. Tianwen 3 involves 2 launches, and the spacecraft will take 7 to 8 months to reach Mars. It will operate on Mars for about a year and then return to Earth, the entire process spanning about 3 years. The whole idea is to first gather samples, in some cases drilling as deep as 2 meters into the Martian surface in order to gather samples from deep within the planet. But the mission won't use a rover. Instead, it will use a drone to collect samples samples from locations within several hundred meters of the landing site. And as I said before, it will conduct 2-meter deep drilling for sample collection. Ho emphasized that planetary protection is a major issue in deep space exploration and that contamination control is a critical challenge that must be addressed. Strict measures are required to prevent the contamination of Mars by the spacecraft and the potential contamination of the Earth's biosphere by Martian samples. China will adhere strictly to the planetary protection policies of the Committee on Space Research to safeguard Mars from terrestrial contamination and protect Earth from potential Martian life, ensuring authentic and reliable scientific results. The Tianwen 3 mission will establish a complete chain in the sample preservation process, from collection and sealing on Mars to transportation and analysis on Earth. Additionally, a high-security Mars sample laboratory will be constructed, featuring ultra-clean and biosafety areas where return samples will undergo strict sterilization, unsealing, processing, and biological risk assessment. The selection of the landing site, according to Ho, is crucial as it directly impacts the achievement of the mission's scientific objectives. From an initial pool of over 80 candidate sites, we have narrowed it down to 19, and by the end of 2026, 3 final candidate sites will be selected. This selection must balance engineering constraints and scientific priorities. Due to engineering limitations, the landing site must be located between 17 degrees and 30 degrees north latitude on Mars. Scientifically, the site should offer the highest potential to harbor and preserve traces of life. This is akin to mineral exploration on Earth. It requires the establishment of theories and models to guide predictions and to then search for a needle in a haystack. Similarly, identifying a suitable landing site requires a study of the conditions needed for the emergence, proliferation, and preservation of life and the developments of predictive models. If there is or was life on Mars, it would be or would have to be the result of the interplay of multiple factors such as liquid water, atmosphere, temperature, magnetic field, and internal structure. An ideal landing site should meet the requirements of habitability and life development, once again, according to Ho. And just to be clear, this is not something new to China. China has already carried out a successful sample return mission from the moon, one of the few successful sample return missions, unmanned sample return missions anyway, that have been carried out from the surface of the moon. The first of these being conducted by the Soviet Union in 1970. Once again, how far has the Soviet space program fallen, given all the firsts that they carried out in the old days, and they can't even land on the moon today? Then again, it could be argued that the United States space program is heading in the same direction, because at the very moment that the triumphant discovery of life on another world should be realized with one final mission, NASA has canceled it because of petty budgetary constraints. Budgetary constraints that are a tiny fraction of what the United States military budget is, and China is taking advantage of this opportunity as their space program is on the rise. So all of this having been said, I have to say that China, if they manage to pull all of this off, they deserve it. They deserve the accolades. They deserve the credit. They deserve to declare to the world that they have been the first to definitively detect evidence of existing life on another planet. And then all of the discoveries that will come after that, well, the majority of them can be attributed to China as well, because they're going to have all of the physical samples. They will have all of the evidence, all of the remarkable proof of life elsewhere. And as I say, I don't think that there should be any resentment towards China whatsoever. They're taking advantage of an opportunity. The United States should have been the ones to follow up on all of the other discoveries that NASA had made over the last 5 decades since Viking first set down on the Martian surface. Should have been the United States to finally wrap all of this up. But simply because of their short-sightedness, their unwillingness to spend money on science, they're going to lose that opportunity. And as far as I'm concerned, they deserve it. The scientists themselves, though, especially the Levin family, Dr. Gilbert Levin having died not that long ago, but nevertheless, his children still alive, those who cared about him still alive. I was one of the last people to interview him. He deserves some recognition for the discovery that he made way back in 1976, when his discovery is going to be validated by China bringing back definitive proof of existing life on Mars. And by the way, I am 100% convinced that there is life on Mars. There's no way that all of these telltale signs have shown up, especially the definitive results of the label release experiment, without there actually being existing and flourishing life on Mars. As I say, just bacterial as far as we know. There might be some kind of multicellular life deep beneath the surface or in caves, something along those lines. Who knows what we might discover in the future? But I am 100% convinced that if China manages to pull this off, and if they get their samples back, and by the way, I totally hope that they pull it off. I 100% support what they're trying to do, and I don't wish them ill at all. If they do manage to do this, they deserve the credit. And once they're able to take credit for all of this, that's when I believe the United States should take a long, hard look at themselves and decide what really is important. Are the countless billions of dollars that are spent on other government programs really that much more important than science to have ceded this incredible discovery to a rival power when it absolutely didn't have to go this way? Is science that unimportant? I think once China is able to congratulate themselves for their discoveries and receive all of the accolades they deserve, I hope that the U.S. takes the hint and doesn't make a disastrous mistake like this again. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, please consider supporting this channel on Patreon and also supporting my upcoming trip to the United States to cover the Artemis 2 mission. Definitely want to bring my producer along on this, ASN as he is known on YouTube. He would be such a huge help. Not only that, the quality of my coverage would increase dramatically if I had some help there. If you want to support this endeavor, all the details once again in the description. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, stay angry about space.